And thank you to the Center for South Asia for hosting this today. And I'm also affiliated with the Center for South Asia and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. So today we are going to talk about the current situation in Sri Lanka, and we have a distinguished panel of speakers who will also offer some thoughts about what we can expect in the future and maybe some recommendations as to how we can get out of the current situation. So I will quickly introduce the speakers today and then in the order that they are going to speak. Some of the speakers are unfortunately experiencing apartheid and might experience apartheid in the middle of this. So that's the current situation in Sri Lanka. So I hope the participants will bear with us if that happens. And as you know, this situation is unprecedented, both in terms of the situation itself and the response of people, how people have got together to protest peacefully. And that was an organic, unorganized sort of event that just happened. So our speakers will address many of these issues. We have economists, political scientists, and lawyers. Our first speaker will be Professor Neil DeVotta, who is a professor in politics and international affairs at the Wake Forest University in the US. His research interests include Asian security and politics, ethno-religious nationalism, ethnic conflict resolution, and democratic transition and consolidation. Our second speaker, and he will give an overview of the situation and talk about the political aspects. Our second speaker is Subhashini Abeysinghe, who is a research director at Verite Research in Colombo. She's an economist specializing in international trade and is an expert on Sri Lankan economy, private sector development, trade policy, WTO, regional trade agreements, ports and logistics. And obviously she will talk about the economic aspects of the situation. Our third speaker is Dr. Dinesha Samararante, who is a law lecturer at the University of Colombo, one of my former students actually. So it's very nice to see a student being represented here. And she will talk about the constitutional law aspects. Our fourth speaker is Professor Sumathy Sivamohan, who is a professor attached to the Department of English at University of Peradeniya in Sri Lanka. And she will talk about the political moment, protests, and the future of democratic action in Sri Lanka. Our fifth speaker is Dinushika Dissanayake, who is the Deputy South Asia Director Research at Amnesty International. And I worked with Dinushika a while ago at the Law and Society Trust. And she will talk about the human rights aspects. And our final speaker is Sankhitha Gunaratne, who is the Deputy Executive Director at Transparency International Sri Lanka. And she will talk about corruption and asset recovery, a big topic in Sri Lanka today. So without further ado, I hand over the mic to Professor Neil DeVotta. Over to you, Neil. And each speaker will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. And I hope in the interest of time, you will keep to the time. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me participate in this meeting. Very happy to be here. And what I think I will do is to try and put this in perspective and bring a bit of history to bear on what's happening in Sri Lanka. Obviously, this is a crisis. It is an unprecedented crisis, as Sumudu mentioned. But it's also a crisis of opportunity, because if Sri Lanka is to go forward, I think the country had to have something like this happen. So the issue is, will it move forward? How will it move forward? But let me kind of, try to put this in perspective by talking about causes. So political scientists and those in the social sciences are fairly big when it comes to trying to identify why certain phenomena take place, and so we tend to focus on causes. There are proximate causes of what's happening with this Aragalia, and there is also a root cause, I think. The proximate causes, of course, are the unsustainable deaths, which I'm sure people who speak after me will address. There is the issue of corruption. There is the issue of inefficient state-owned enterprises. There is COVID-19 and the problems that were caused with remittances and the lack of tourism, all of which are contributing to a balance of payments crisis. So if you want to think of the immediate cause or the proximate cause as a balance of payments crisis that has then unleashed, this fury in the form of the Aragalia, that I think is fairly accurate. But there is also a root cause. And this is where I think I'm going to make a few people uncomfortable, because the root cause goes back in time. So those of you who watched the Adadarana news yesterday, the 18th, I tend to watch it usually. I try to watch it, and when I do watch it, it's about 10 or 11 hours later. And I think the channel itself is doing a much better job than it used to in the past, where I tend to seem to lean towards the Rajapaksa. It seems to be more objective these days. But it started, this is the 10 o'clock news, it started by commemorating the end of the Civil War, so 13 years since the Civil War ended. And what was striking was that the segment began with the killing of Alfred Duraiappah, who was the mayor of Jaffna in 1975. And Duraiappah was killed by Prabhakaran. And for anyone who didn't know anything about the Sinhalese-Tamil divide in Sri Lanka and the Civil War, watching that newscast, you would have simply thought that the reason for the Civil War, the impetus for the Civil War, that was the killing of Alfred Duraiappah in 1975, and the quest then on the part of Prabhakaran and the LTT to create a separate state. In fact, that was basically the way in which this segment was kind of, put together. That was the basis of the segment. And then it went on to talk about, Rajapaksa and the end of the Civil War and all that. The root cause of what we are experiencing today goes back at least to the 1950s. And this was basically the beginning of a Sinhalese Buddhist ethnocracy being put into place. And I don't mean to offend anybody here, but I think it's important if we're going to move forward in this country in trying to create a more pluralist society. You can create that kind of society. And I think the opportunity is now here, finally, for people to recognize some of those mistakes, acknowledge the mistakes, and then try to rectify them. But you can't move forward without rectifying mistakes of the past. And so the root cause, as far as I'm concerned, is the attempt, and the successful attempt, actually, because it's an enterprise that has succeeded fantastically. And it leads gradually to not just Sinhala being made the official language, but then Sinhalese Buddhist especially being privileged in so many different ways. It leads to an outflow of qualified people, not just minorities, people from all backgrounds who find the developing situation distasteful. I saw a stat about 2 weeks ago. I don't know how accurate it is, but it said there were 3 million Sri Lankans living in the West. That may be an overestimation. It's perhaps 3 million all over the world, including the Middle East. But that's a large number of people. And when we think of all those who want to leave the country because of the dire situation they find themselves in, it is a sad situation. With this kind of, ethnocracy that comes into being, so much so that you have a military that is probably 97% Sinhalese, you have a bureaucracy that is probably 92, 93%. We don't have accurate numbers, but I think anyone familiar with the country realizes that, we have the country has moved in a direction privileging one particular community at the expense of others. And that in turn then has allowed people like a number of politicians, but the Rajapaksas were, I think, the maestros at whipping up Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism, masking corruption in the process, further degrading governance. But all of this, for me at least, there's a starting point. There is, in political science, we talk about path dependency. So think about a tree and you start climbing. Think about a massive tree and you start climbing this tree, and there are different branches that you can cling on to and move up. And those different branches are going to take you in slightly different directions. And the more you start to move up along a particular branch, the harder it becomes to reverse yourself. And when it comes to governance and policy making, every time you start to move in a particular direction, you create constituencies that start to benefit from the policies that have been crafted. And so it becomes very, very hard to move back. So we end up with 1.5, 1.6 million people working for the state. Now, who is going to get rid of these people? I mean, can we even get rid of them? How do you accommodate them going forward if you're trying to restructure the state? You have maybe a military when you count the police and the reserves, the civil defense forces, that's probably 350,000 to 400,000. That I think is part of the 1.6, 1.7 number that gets bandied about when we talk about government servants. And so in some ways then, this Aragalaya has provided us an opportunity, because without something like this, what we have here is a bottom-up pressure. It's pressure brought to bear on the state at the grassroots level. And it's pushing people now to think in terms of, a transformed state. There are some interesting proposals that were last week put out by former President Sankhitha Gunaratne. Interestingly, these are not proposals that address things like accountability. At some point, the country would need to deal with these issues that took place at the end of the Civil War before it can move forward. Can it even move forward without being truthful about what transpired, towards the end of the Civil War? But if it tried to deal with those issues, would it, at least as far as the military is concerned and others who stand to be held responsible for what happened, muddy the waters and make things even harder? So I guess I will end with this idea that the Aragalaya is a prerequisite. I see it as, if the country is going to transform itself into a more viable democracy, a pluralist democracy, and I don't see Sri Lanka achieving its potential unless it can embrace pluralism. And there is, there's ample room for this. I mean, the stories that kind of, people put together about the countries that they are a part of are very, very important. And the story that's been told since like perhaps the latter part of the 19th century is a story that privileges majoritarianism. it's Dutagamanu and it's all that stuff. And there's enough, if you even took the Mahavamsa, there's enough there that you can draw from that that allows for a story to be retold that incorporates minorities, that builds on the contribution of minorities. And so I think the stories that people have to tell about themselves and their countries are very important in terms of crafting a national identity. And in that sense, there is, I think, the possibility for a more wholesome, better, and a brighter Sri Lanka, coming about from this protest. And let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Neil. And for those of you who don't know what Aragalaya is, it basically means protest. And Neil was referring to the peaceful protests that have been taking place in Sri Lanka. Our next speaker is Subhashini Abeysinghe, and she will talk about the economic aspects of the situation. Over to you, Subhashini. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. And in my short intervention, I will just outline very briefly what led us to this economic crisis. And I identified 3 factors that contributed to this crisis from an economic point of view, because current crisis we are facing is very much economic crisis created by a debt crisis and a balance of payment crisis. So there are 3 reasons that led to it. First, in my view, first is that Sri Lankan economy was already at a weak position at the time the country was entering into the pandemic and facing pandemic-induced health and economic crisis. And second, just before the pandemic, before 2020, the government that came into power in 2019 took certain policy decisions that further weakened the economy and eroded the fiscal space and the capacity of the country to manage the health and the economic crisis posed by the pandemic. And lastly, even during the pandemic, the decisions taken by the government to address the problem actually worsened the situation. It didn't really, ease the situation. On top of that, they also extensively delayed taking corrective action. So I'll show you a few slides to tell you why I say that Sri Lankan economy was at a weaker place when it was facing entering into the pandemic in 2020. So Sri Lankan economy was experiencing already very low growth rates of around 2-3% even before the pandemic. And in 2019, it faced an Easter Sunday attack that also further weakened the economy and had an adverse impact on the economy. And Sri Lankan economy for a long time had one of the biggest economic problems that they say was a twin deficit problem. Sri Lanka had very high fiscal deficits and high trade deficits. The fiscal deficits were created by Sri Lanka. Government revenue to GDP ratio is one of the lowest in the world. Although we had high deficits, even our expenditure was low. So already the amount of money we were spending on health, education, welfare was already low. And this is why we ran high fiscal deficits and accumulated quite a lot of debt. And not only that, when we talk about the twin deficit, even Sri Lanka was very weak in earning foreign exchange. So we went down the path of borrowing foreign exchange. We took a lot of loans, foreign loans, to actually fund our infrastructure and capital investments, because we didn't generate enough tax money to fund infrastructure and capital investments in any case. We didn't have enough tax revenue even to meet our recurrent expenditure. So we were not able to meet the government servants' wages and salaries and interest payments and welfare payments that are day-to-day expenditure. We didn't generate enough revenue. And we had weak foreign exchange earnings. Sri Lanka's exports have been stagnating around $10 to $11 billion for about a decade or more. And we had around 19 to 20 billion of imports. And you can see Sri Lanka's exports to GDP ratio has been declining continuously. And we have been struggling to get foreign direct investments even after the end of the war, because during the war, people thought it was the security concerns and other reasons what prevented FDI. But even after the end of war, Sri Lanka struggled to get FDI. And the other foreign earnings were remittances and tourism. So Sri Lanka was not in a very strong position or a healthy position to face the kind of crisis that was created by the pandemic. And then on top of that, Sri Lankan government that came to power took decisions that further eroded the tax base and the tax revenue that was already very low. So they revised taxes downwards, they changed the way how the tax is levied and paid. And as a result, what happened was you realize Sri Lanka's tax base was already very narrow. It further narrowed. You can see that there's substantial reduction in income tax payers because of the revisions made to the income tax. And where we ended up was seeing a drastic decline in revenue. So Sri Lanka's revenue had already been quite low. This is tax revenue, not the total revenue. So tax revenue, but we had already always managed to maintain about 10% revenue. But for the first time historically, Sri Lanka just had revenue below 10%, and it was one of the lowest in the entire world. And what was interesting is even on a normal year, the country struggles to generate enough revenue to manage its day-to-day payments. But now with this revenue decline after paying for salaries, wages, and pensions, Sri Lanka didn't have enough money even to pay their interest to the loans and to make the welfare payments. So again, another reason I said is during the pandemic, Sri Lanka took decisions that actually worsened the situation. One of the decisions was to hold on to the exchange rate. So Sri Lanka tried to manage an exchange rate without really having any foreign reserves or dollars to defend the exchange rate. And obviously, many people knew that a government that doesn't have dollars trying to defend the exchange rate means at one point of time, they're going to let go of it and the exchange rate will crash. As a result, most of the people who earned in dollars didn't want to send back the money into Sri Lanka. So as a result, even the meager foreign earnings that Sri Lanka was making was not coming into the country because of this, the government trying to hold on to the foreign exchange. And it also created a black market of foreign exchange where the dollars were exchanging at a much higher rate than the official rate. And at last, when the government decided to take action and let go of the foreign exchange, just like everybody expected, for example, in a month, the foreign currency depreciated by over 48%. So because of all of this, what happened was Sri Lanka's sovereign credit rating took a hit, and we have been downgraded continuously, and Sri Lanka is virtually locked out of international financial markets. We can no longer go to the international financial markets and borrow money. And all this happened at a time where Sri Lanka's debt repayments are growing. So Sri Lanka's debt repayments on average before 2019 was around $2 billion a year. But you could see it almost doubled since 2019. So Sri Lanka was facing all of these, its space and capacity shrinking and its earnings declining. And even tourist earnings, even in 2019, tourist earnings took a hit because of the Easter Sunday attacks. And 2020, we know across the world, the tourist earnings declined. And 2021, when Sri Lanka was trying to recover, Sri Lanka faced both external and domestic challenges. Externally, for example, China is a main source of foreign tourists into Sri Lanka. We know Chinese tourists have been missing from the market because of the zero COVID policy of China. And then most recently, even the Ukraine-Russia war is not helping Sri Lankan tourism because Russian tourists are also Russia is also an important source of crisis, the power shortages and fuel shortages, and also the protests on the street, and some warnings sent by certain countries to people traveling into Sri Lanka has also made it very challenging for the tourism sector to recover. So you have all these challenges at a time you have to make these debt repayments. And obviously, Sri Lankan government was in a position that it could not pay back the debt. So, so many experts envisaged this well in advance, and there was basically there was a request for the government to really acknowledge that it can no longer pay back this debt, and therefore going to negotiations with the IMF and to go for a debt restructuring. But unfortunately, Sri Lankan government kept on delaying the plan or agreeing to restructure the debt or go to the IMF until really the problem grew to the current level where the country does not have any reserves, no dollars, and it is unable to buy the most essential things like oil and food and medicines. And this has created enormous economic stress for the people who are coming out of the pandemic, already unemployed, already having less income and less economic opportunities, and you're faced with this crisis. And to make matters worse, when I said Sri Lankan government not only delayed taking corrective action, it also took decisions that was really not necessary but worsened the situation. A very good example is the fertilizer policy of the government. The government in April 2020 is imports into the country, and within one season wanted to really transition into an organic agriculture country which is doing organic agriculture. And it obviously completely backfired, and as a result, you created an unnecessary food shortage and a increase in food prices on top of the food price increase that is coming from abroad. So there were many decisions taken like that that also created unnecessary pain for the people. And I'm sure I will just show these slides about the debt crisis and end quickly. I'm sure, I don't know, maybe my time is already up, Sumudu. Give me just 1 minute to quickly say, because I'm sure the US audience is always interested in saying who actually, to whom do we owe the debt? Because there is a lot of interest in knowing, is this debt we owe to China that is driving this crisis? I thought I'll just share this slide. China is obviously an important source of debt for Sri Lanka, but actually this crisis is driven largely by the debt we owe to the financial markets, and especially the maturing international sovereign bonds. So relatively, the loans we owe to China is relatively low out of the total debt we owe to total foreign debt. And just to say, even the cost, I think a lot of people talk about the cost of Chinese debt. Our calculations at least show that Chinese debt we have taken from China, while more expensive than the other bilateral, multilateral sources, are definitely cheaper than the international sovereign bonds we have taken from the international financial market, which is the highest portion of foreign debt today. But just to say that with China debt, the only problem that we've identified is sort of an understatement of Chinese debt. So what is officially reported as central government debt doesn't include the debt by the state-owned enterprises. So if you add, it increases, but still it is not the main problem that is causing the current debt stress. So I will stop now, and maybe I'm happy to answer any questions you have later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Subhashini. Our next speaker is Dinesha Samararante, who will talk about the constitutional law aspects. Over to you, Dinesha.
Thank you, Sumudu, and thank you for the invitation to share my views and be part of this panel. As Sumudu mentioned, I was in one of the last classes she taught before she left University of Colombo, and it's been a pleasure to be in touch with Sumudu since then and continue to work with on different occasions. I must apologize for not switching on my camera. I'm currently experiencing a power cut, which means that I can't light up the room in a way that will help the video function. Okay, so my role has been made significantly easy by both Neil and Subhashini, as they both explained. Really, our economic and human crisis has been created by a political crisis. And I mean, in the literal sense of the word, given the lack of inclusiveness and underrepresentation of women in governance in Sri Lanka, it is a man-made crisis. So I will, in the time given to me, try to explain some of the structural aspects which have contributed to or enabled decision makers to let this crisis happen or cause it, and then identify some positive outcomes that we've seen over the last 2 months, primarily attributed to the people's protests, and then share my reflections on how I think about the way forward, if there is a way forward, that is. So as mentioned by both Sumudu and Neil, one of the most unexpected aspects of this crisis has been how the people responded to it. The peaceful and organic and sustained protests were difficult to predict. They started in small pockets and then grew to be this particularly significant moment in Sri Lanka's political history. But this is just one episode in a long series of stories about protests in Sri Lanka. But speaking to this moment, the ruptures created in our society by these protests and the economic pressures that preceded and continue to sort of affect our daily lives has allowed several developments to take place. And I'll go through them very quickly because I'm sure Sumathy would have more to say about this. One is it allowed older forms of dissent to gain some prominence or more prominence. So if you think of ethnic minorities or the farmers or the workers, university students who've been protesting for much longer are now heard by a wider audience and are also received quite warmly by two groups that I think of, the middle class and also other members of the ethnic majority. Secondly, and here I'm invoking Professor Jayadeva Uyangada's ideas, it compelled a large group of Sri Lankans who were primarily voters to exercise their political agency and to sort of play the role of citizens. And you see that playing out in so many different ways, and I'm not going to talk about that. And as a result, it opened up an unexpected, unanticipated moment for constitutional reform. And I'll explain why I think it's unanticipated and quite unique. So at one stage in this sort of build up with the protests, two concrete proposals were placed before Parliament. But before I get to that, I think I should just flag or highlight the point that I made about how the political structures that existed contributed to and enabled and created this economic crisis. So, for instance, Subhashini talked about borrowing, she talked about certain problematic policies, and then also she spoke about how government continued to ignore warnings that were made by experts who could predict what was going to happen. So how was that possible? There are several answers to that, but one answer lies in our current constitutional system, which is a semi-presidential system. And ironically, the proponent of this executive presidential system justified its introduction on three grounds. One was this idea of a moral society, or what he described as a dharmishta society. The other reason that was presented was economic development and rapid economic development. And the third was national security. And as one of my colleagues said at one of our meetings recently, on all three counts, we can now say that the executive presidency did not deliver. Not only did it not deliver, there is evidence to suggest that it exaggerated and compounded these problems that we've had in Sri Lanka now for some time. So the executive presidency is a systemic problem we have in the country. So coming back to the reforms, constitutional reforms that were proposed, two concrete proposals were made, one by a so-called independent group and the other by the main political party in the opposition, the Samagijana Balawege, or the SJB. And I will only speak to the proposals by the SJB for two reasons. One is the lack of time, but also because I've come to form the view that those proposals in fact present a relatively progressive set of proposals, possibly the best set of proposals we've had since the 2000 draft constitution. Now this bill, the proposals seek to do a few things. One is it seeks to abolish the executive presidency and in its place proposes a president who will be elected by parliament. It reintroduces parliamentary democracy, but it's a modified or adapted model of Westminster parliamentary democracy. And I say that because of the innovations that are being reintroduced in the form of what we call a fourth branch. And I'll explain what that is in a minute. It also introduces two new bodies, one for national security and the other very, very broadly framed as a state council, which is, I think, meant to be like a consultative body. And it also includes proposals to reform the cabinet and also to try and control this problem of crossovers. So that's very, very quickly it's a short overview of the SJB proposals. But here I want to say something about the fourth branch because I feel like that's an important development that we've seen during this time. By fourth branch, what I mean is public institutions which are not the judiciary, not the executive, not parliament. So think Human Rights Commission or Elections Commission, statutory and constitutional bodies which are meant to function independently in order to preserve and promote a particular democratic norm. And interestingly, this is an idea that pre-existed in the form of an independent public service, pre-independence and soon after, and then re-emerges late 1980s onwards, pushed for by the people, and then eventually there's a story to be told about how it comes in through the 17th Amendment, and then there's a back and forth. It's taken out by the 18th Amendment, brought back again in a modified form in the 19th Amendment, taken out again by the 20th Amendment, and now we are talking about a 21st Amendment. I don't have much time, so I will leave it at that, but the main story or takeaway about the fourth branch is that both groups have proposed returning to an independent fourth branch, which I think is a lesson to be learned about the resilience of the idea of independent mechanisms. And it ties up very well with Subhashini's intervention about the failure of the government to prevent and to take necessary measures to avert this crisis. So the final point I want to make is this, and that is about state capture. Now, I know Neil explained why we are here and how we got to where we are. And I think that is one way to explain our history and our context. I also wonder whether we need to add to this a story about state capture. And here I just say two things, Sumudu, and I will stop. Just to say this, I think it's not just a question about state capture as a story of democratic decay or decline. People in Sri Lanka have seen how Parliament has failed to fulfill its role despite all the gains that have been made by the protests. I wonder whether Sri Lanka's state, by design, has had this idea of existing for private gain, as sort of having this tradition in it of neutralizing internal and external checks. And whether that's what we are seeing being entrenched today which is why it's so difficult to dislodge it, despite people dying in queues, despite people dying at these protests and clashes, and despite the kind of sustained protests that have gained momentum over time. So finally, the way forward, sorry, I kept saying finally now thrice, I think. The way forward, I think the story about the Aragale is difficult to predict. I am not sure whether the 21st Amendment will go through in its present form in the SJB proposals. And finally, I think there is also a story to be told and questions to be asked about the role of the international community, the IMF, the World Bank, foreign policy, debt relief, debt restructuring. So there is a global conversation to be had as well. Sorry, Sumudu, for maybe taking too much time. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinesha. I know there's a lot to be said about constitutional reform. I was myself involved in this 20 years ago, and we are still talking about it without a new constitution in place. Our next speaker is Professor Sumathy Sivamohan, who will talk about the political moment and the future of democratic action. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to read, so I'm going to be a little quick. Can you hear me? I have a slight sore throat. Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, protest and political action all changed utterly. Yeats in Easter 1916. I'm going to be taking a little, I'm going to be talking about the protest and what has happened and what's, I think, is happening. In a way, I look at it in quite dissimilar ways from Professor DeVotta. And I would, and I think as I continue, I'm signaling that here because it's very important for us, I feel, for us to understand the composite nature of the protest. So we are all inside, we are inside the protest and we are outside the protest, analyzing the protest while we are taking part in it. We are inside the country and outside the country, but we all are moved by that, by what is going on, because we see something very decisive happening in the, maybe we can say, mindset, the approach to both the economy and and governance. I think Dinesha and others, I mean, they're very apt in saying that a moment has opened up in the way we look at, the people look at governance. And I would, and governance I see as something that's not separate from the economy, and the economy is not separate from the structure of governance. And I would say the people's mobilization today has to do with both of these elements. So maybe I will draw upon Gramsci's historical conjuncture, but will not talk about it here, just for me to kind of float something theoretical. The genesis of the recent spate of protests go back beyond the COVID years. I mean, but also, I mean, as somebody said, but also during the COVID years, I mean, this particular wave of protest, I would say, has its genesis in the COVID years. We had in April 21, we had women protesting against microfinance loans in the heartland of the farming, farming culture in Sri Lanka. And then we have the farmers' protest from August 21 to November 21, intermittently. And of course, we have had the women in the north protesting continuously from the time the war ended on a variety of issues, but also on economic issues, the hardship, militarization, the loss of land. And Dinesha very reminded us of the university students protesting, particularly against privatization education. And as we speak, I think today there was the IUSF Student Association had one of the big protests. one of the things about the COVID was that we expected at the time when we were all like hunkering down, in our homes and were waiting, and we looked to the government for something that would provide relief, and the laboring force was thrown out of work. The government's budget was about privatization, digitalizing education as a form of privatization of it, investment in tourism, investment in land. And there was very little talk of any attempt to look inward and produce safety nets. Instead, I mean, they were talking of the budget, talked of the budget 2021, talked of entrepreneurship. So instead of talking of women's labor, on which the country's economy relied, the budget put forward this very nebulous concept of entrepreneurship. Subhashini has talked about the tax cuts, and I'm not sure about the tax cuts so much. I mean, there's the VAT and the wealth tax. I mean, there was the indirect tax and the income and wealth tax. I mean, I belong to different groups of people who are asking for an increase in the wealth tax. So I will kind of bracket that out here for the moment, because a tax is also about what we want to tax. So if the government is going to be, if the revenue has to be collected from taxation, they are not doing it in the right way, as far as I'm concerned, and the groups I'm aligned with are concerned, but are, putting the burden on the people all over again. So this is the kind of the logic for deprivation that fueled the protests. And this is important when we think of what the protests mean and will mean. So there's a twin alliance of factors that the protests have taken on: the economy and governance. And what they have done with regard to governance is to make a revolutionary call for participation in governance. In asking the regime to be accountable to the people for the massive failure and debacle, it has become the custom to separate the economy and the idea of governance, the regime. But the protests have brought them together. The failure of governance is being seen by many as a failure of a clean government, corruption of mammoth proportions that has gone completely out of control. The executive presidency. So I'm kind of shifting. I mean, as Dinesha said, the debate, there's a dialogue, the discussion. This has provided us with a moment to talk about, one of the most tenacious features of our system that people had been trying to get rid of, but had not been, the executive presidency. Vesting powers on a single entity has led to the slow but steady erosion of democratic action at the ground level. It has instituted a system of patronage, destroyed relatively lower levels of representative governance that the parliamentary system enshrines. And the MPs, members of parliament, they become beholden to the central figure and reliant on the crumbs from his table, rather than on mobilizing their constituencies. Constituencies are made and remade from the top through lines of patronage that bypass the influence and the political action of elected representatives. Representatives then become servicemen and sometimes women doing the dirty work for those at the top. I have spoken about this elsewhere, so I don't want to go back to this, but I mean, for us to understand what is so bad about the executive presidency, one has to, I think we need to understand it as a very undemocratic institution, and an institution that has destroyed participatory governance. And of course, as Dinesha said, there was an economic logic to this. And that when JR brought it in, he had this idea that the executive presidency would support liberalization. And we are at the stage beyond liberalization, and which is commonly called neoliberalization, emphasizing the liquidation of assets, financialization, where every resource is turned into money or speculation. So the executive presidency then becomes the sole figure, sometimes a lone figure, but at the same time, totally authoritarian. And that lends itself to the building of a dynastic culture. So there is a very organic relation between the executive presidency and the culture it has built, between that and the economic and corruption and the way the economy has been run, because you can have deals. You don't have to consult anybody. You can build a port, you can build roads, you can do this, you can say, okay, I want to take over this land. And then the parliament has become so weak, there's nobody to contest that. So I'm going to skip a lot because some of the others have spoken about it, but maybe during question time we can go back to it. What do the pretas then mean in terms of what we expect from it and what we want it to fuel, and what is the future that we as protesters envision? The pretas are direct action, and there's actually they are talking of participation. The historical, they are direct action, and they are questioning the moments of compromise that we have known all along. And today's compromise, Ranil Wickremesinghe is prime minister, he and the president will together will pull the country out of the mire, the Rajapaksas will return vengeful and scheming as ever, and we will slip into politics as usual. That moment is being kept on hold. The Yahapalana government of 2015 was that compromise. There was this clamor for change in 2014, 2015, and people voted the Sirisena Wickremesinghe government into power, and everything was back to business as usual. And then the Rajapaksas returned. I mean, we might still be within this kind of retrograde, regressive moment. I don't know. Once petrol pours in, will it pour in? I don't know. Does petrol pour? Once the IMF deal is done and the middle classes can survive, maybe with a lot of hardship, but still maintain their privileges, all this might be a distant dream. But what has this moment opened up? A reflection on the country as a whole, the executive presidency, an economy that is keenly alive to the needs of the people. One moment, I'm losing that. An economy that's keenly alive to the needs of the people. The very great imperative reconciling ethnicities within the task of nation building, even to the extent of questioning the idea of nation. And we are not yet there. We are not yet there. Women have played a great role in the pretas. Will they continue to? Trade unions are emerging once again as a distinctive force. And that is very important because after the 1981 general strike and the trade unions were destroyed, there was this long hiatus with a few trade unions here and there trying to do something. But will there be a renaissance? Or will there be a different kind of renaissance for the trade unions? some
Sorry to interrupt. Your time is up, and we have two more speakers, Professor Sivamohan.
Yeah, okay. I'll just, okay, I didn't get the warning, but okay, the notification. Have you outlived the concept of economic? Some take-home questions of fundamental import. Have we outlived the concept of economic growth for mainstream economic policy? We are still caught within the constraining construct of the nation, but something fundamental has happened. The idea of nation still prevails, but within the reconstituted notion of a suffering multi-ethnicity made up of several minorities and not of a majority and several minorities. I mean, there's a lot more work to be done here, but can we take class itself as a common denominator? Is that enough? Or should it be a form of decentralization of power, a recognition of devolution of power? Very quickly, we need participatory governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Dinushika Dissanayake, who will talk about the human rights aspects of the situation.
Thank you, Dr. Sumudu. Just trying to share my screen. Thank you. So I'm really privileged and honored to speak with you all today, especially in the sort of the global context where Sri Lanka's economic crisis is not getting the type of coverage that we would have expected, given the extent of the human rights concerns that it throws up. I just want to check whether everyone can see the screen. Is it visible? I think so. So in terms of the human rights concerns that the economic crisis is throwing up, one of the major issues, of course, is in terms of the economic and social rights, and that's what I want to focus on today. And I'm just going over here some of the facts and figures that the new Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, presented last Monday in his first address to the nation since he was appointed. And Subhashini has gone over some of these numbers. And I mean, the extent of the debt became clear to most people, the ordinary and average person, only in the last few weeks. And as you can see, according to the Prime Minister, the budget deficit for the year is 2.4 trillion. Sri Lanka immediately requires $75 million within the next few days in order to just control the queues for fuel, for cooking gas, and so many other daily essentials. The Prime Minister also said that petrol, diesel, and crude oil ships are at the port, but they were unable to pay to unload the requirements. He also mentioned that there will be expected daily power cuts of up to 15 hours a day. We've already had 13-hour power cuts earlier in April. Thankfully, these have eased. But as you see, even today, some of us faced power cuts during the discussion, and this is a daily occurrence. Sri Lanka is also facing a massive gas shortage, cooking gas. Every day there are protests, quite apart from the Aragalaya, which is taking place at Golface and in an organized manner. Ordinary people are queuing up, and when they are unable to find gas, to find fuel that is petrol or diesel, they then get on the streets and they protest, blocking streets. And then perhaps the most critical is the lack of medicine, equipment, and food for patients, for which, according to the Prime Minister, we have to pay 34 billion rupees. And then, of course, essential medicines are already in short supply. For example, the Castle Street Hospital, the premier state hospital for pregnant women, is missing even very basic supplies like cotton wool. and are running on donations that are coming in from overseas. That gives you a picture of how dire the situation is in terms of essential medicines and equipment. As of Monday, he informed the nation that it is a challenge for the Treasury to find $1 million. And according to different estimates, Sri Lanka needs around 500 million a month to meet its full supply. And we had petrol stocks for only one single day. As it is, it's almost impossible to find petrol, and queues are snaking around blocks up to kilometers, and this is prevalent across the country. The solutions that were proffered included privatizing of the national airline, Sri Lankan Airlines, printing money to pay state sector employees, which he acknowledged would increase inflation. And then, of course, looking for international solidarity and foreign allies to support Sri Lanka at this difficult time. In addition, of course, there have been conversations on debt restructuring and going to the IMF for support. Now, in terms of the major human rights concerns, right to health is one of the major issues that are coming up. Food and nutrition is going to continue to be a problem in the coming weeks and months, not only because of the crisis in terms of importation, but also because of the fertilizer policies and the forced conversion to organic farming last year, which led to what we are now seeing as a food crisis. And then access to housing, safe water, sanitation, and then, of course, right to food and an adequate standard of living, which encompasses all of this. We've also seen, some of the other speakers spoke about the issues of freedom of expression, association, and assembly that have come up. Already, we have seen the nature of assaults on protesters at different times, while at other times protests were permitted to continue peacefully. We've seen how the brutal scenes that took place on the 9th of May, and then earlier in April, the shooting at peaceful protesters who were demanding gas. And I'm looking specifically at right to health today because of the grave consequences of retrogression on the guarantee of the right to health. And we're already seeing some of these markers of guaranteeing right to health being violated. Availability in terms of sufficient quantity, for example, even over-the-counter drugs like paracetamol were impossible to find at one time. And many are now depending on people who bring it in hand luggage or send it via other means from abroad. And then accessibility to everyone without discrimination, and the class dynamics and the intersectional impact on people, especially women, children, and marginalized groups, when it comes to accessing drugs and medicine when supply is scarce. And then, of course, physical accessibility, affordability, having information and acceptability to everyone. All of these issues are now very much at risk of being violated. And then, of course, there are core minimum obligations. Even if a country is going through a massive economic crisis as we are, there are certain core minimum obligations that Sri Lanka would have under international human rights law. And these include access to health facilities and minimum essential food, ensuring basic shelter, housing, sanitation, essential drugs. The Prime Minister's speech highlighted some of the drugs that are missing, which would qualify as essential drugs, and emergency services would be crippled without these. And so, the real issue I wanted to focus on today was the austerity measures that we might see being rolled out in the coming months as Sri Lanka deals with the crisis. And of course, the austerity measures themselves are needed, for the country to come out of the crisis it's facing, but there are certain minimum standards that should be met when it does implement austerity measures. One, of course, being that it should be temporary and should only cover the period of the economic crisis. And we've seen this in other countries, in Greece, in Spain. It is vital that any measures that are introduced are temporary, especially given Sri Lanka's, guarantees so far on issues like right to education and right to health. And then it must be legitimate, it must be necessary and reasonable. All of these are issues that could only be assessed if there is a human rights-based assessment of the situation and the measures that are being proposed by any agency, whether it's the IMF, whether it's ADB and World Bank, or whether it's a bilateral agreement that leads to financial measures being put in place. And then proportionality, whether the measures that are being put in place are proportional to the economic crisis and the need that has been highlighted. It should not be discriminatory, and it must meet the minimum core content, some of which I detailed out previously. And then it must be subject to meaningful review and accountability. And both of these are essential if we are to go back to the temporary nature of such measures. If there isn't regular and meaningful review, these measures can go on without an end date, to the detriment of guarantees of human rights and the country's human rights obligations. And of course, the core obligations include, as I said before, some of these in terms of right to food and medicine. There's also the guiding principles on foreign debt, which would apply to agencies like the IMF in terms of not hindering progressive realization of economic and social and cultural rights, and ensuring that repayment of external debt and any measures and obligations that arise from new external debt or even existing external debt does not lead to a deliberate adoption of measures that will regress on current protections. And then how transparent and participatory and accountable these measures are and the decisions are. And so the importance of anyone who is affected by these measures having an opportunity to participate in the decision. And then, of course, within this transparency, participation and accountability issues, the full disclosure of all relevant information is vital. None of this should take place behind closed doors and without public scrutiny in any way. Public debt audits is vital as well, given the questions of corruption that already plague Sri Lanka's political and executive landscape. And then, of course, meaningful input from all stakeholders and remedial measures to ensure that decision-making is accountable and not done in impunity. I'm just running through this bit because I know many of you may be already aware of this. Sri Lanka has ratified or signed on to many of the major human rights conventions and covenants, and these include the ICACR, CEDAW, and then of course Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CRC, and I've highlighted here some of the
Hi, Dinushika, you're breaking up and your time is up as well.
The core articles that the economic and social
Yeah, Dinushika seems to be having some technical difficulties. Let's go to our final speaker, who is Sankhitha Gunaratne, who will talk about corruption and asset recovery. Over to you. And thank you, Dinushika.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be able to be on this panel this evening, in Sri Lanka at least. And most of all, kind of leading off of what some of the speakers were saying before me, this is proving to be quite a moment for Sri Lanka to reflect even on the topic I'm speaking about, which is on corruption. Because we all understand that corruption is the root cause of a lot of ills, but often you find that there are few groups that focus on the problem, but often we don't really spend the time and resources needed to talk about it and to address it. And now suddenly we have this huge political moment where people across the country actually echoing back to their representatives things that they've been hearing about corruption. So in Sri Lanka's context, we see both petty and grand corruption. So as petty corruption, what we talk about is the kind of day-to-day corruption, the small amounts being, exchanged under the table, or just, in order to avoid a traffic fine or things like that. But in addition to that, we have grand corruption, that is the large amounts of money and money pilfered or subjected to corruption, but also high-level corruption. So these two combined actually lead to this context of systemic corruption, which we find ourselves difficult to get out of. But today I want to suggest, and I know when Dinesha has been talking about this, that Sri Lanka may very well be in the throes of what we call state capture. And now state capture is when the laws, policies, things like the constitution, institutions of a country are captured or are diverted or subverted in the interest of a few. So they're no longer being used, or they're no longer actually created or functioning in the public interest. So what are the real markers of state capture? You look at the structural weakening of accountability systems like the constitution, having law enforcement authorities' powers taken away, having things like the Presidential Commission of Inquiry on political victimization, making recommendations that kind of fly in the face of the separation of powers, then making recommendations to even the judiciary of the country to lay by certain ongoing court cases, things like that. And then you have the politicization of the public service in Sri Lanka. You have state-owned enterprises, over 500 state-owned enterprises that are basically used as vehicles for corruption rather than as true enterprises that make profit. So most of them are loss-making. There is only public information available for about 50 of them, and annual accounts available for only about 10 of them. So this is a really dire situation, and that's a structure that's basically used to hand out political favors and give appointments to allies and family most of the time. Then you have a compromised public procurement system where the country would contract goods, services, and works in a very opaque manner. What we have are public procurement guidelines. It is not a law, but it is given the force of law. But still, it has been recognized by the judiciary, but still you would find that at cabinet level and at the very high levels, there is a lot of decision making done with very little transparency and accountability, and public accountability as well, leave alone to law enforcement. And then you have massive conflicts of interest. If you think of the president and the prime minister, the two arms of government being led by the persons of the same family, starting from there, the amount of the budget that was until very recently controlled by a single family, the budget of the country controlled by a single family. You put that together with the kind of attacks on dissent and the censorship that's taking place, or was. It's difficult to dislodge the past from the present right now, but the kind of attacks on the media, attacks on journalists, the fear psychosis that's created for even civil society to function, for human rights defenders to function. Then you get the weaponization of social media to possibly create disinformation and misinformation to the extent that it could sway voters and entire vote bases. Then you combine that with, put that together with professional enablers who provide financial services, legal services for corrupt actions to take place. In the context of militarization, in the context of our foreign, supposedly non-aligned foreign policy being used from government to government, used or abused through time. And then you have, while it's difficult to say that the judiciary is no longer independent, you still have entire spades of cases that are laid by, that are withdrawn, that are allowed to be withdrawn by the judiciary, that also ask this question of where we are really in terms of independence of the judiciary. So you put those things together, we have a really dire situation of possible state capture. But today, because of the heightened interest in the subject of asset recovery, I'll go into that in a little detail. So when we're talking about asset recovery, what we're really talking about is money that has been stolen from the state coffers by individuals or groups. And largely we're talking about money that has been expatriated and about recovering it back to the country. So we've been observing certain misinformation or possibly even disinformation spreading about how we can trigger a process of asset recovery. So I think it's important to talk about who can initiate action for asset recovery. So if you look at cases across the world, asset recovery takes about 10 years to happen successfully, based on the cases that have happened so far. So, and in most of these cases, the initiator of the asset recovery action has been the origin country, the government of the origin country, that is the country from which the assets were stolen. So there itself, we have a hurdle right now with the context that Sri Lanka is in, whether the government can or has the political will to initiate asset recovery action. Then you have the destination countries, that is the countries where the assets are. So it may be a yacht, it may be a property in New York, London, Sydney, as per the claims in the, or the allegations in the Pandora Papers. So in situations like that, so the US is relevant right now, there are two routes that you can go. The first is legal, the second is political. The legal one is where law enforcement in the destination countries take action to look into the ownership of those assets in the destination country and look at whether those are the proceeds of crime. The second route, that is political, is to impose sanctions on individuals, enterprises, families, etc. Now that doesn't have to go through a law enforcement and judicial process. That would be something that can be done by the Department of Justice, that by the Treasury for the US, or the EU can impose sanctions, the UK can impose sanctions. So that's a quicker process, but that would still only be the start of an asset recovery process if you look at it in terms of freezing. Then there is the possibility of civil society or people in destination countries initiating action. So if you look at what happened in France about the assets of the vice president of Equatorial Guinea found in France, there were two civil society organizations that initiated action in France and successfully obtained a verdict, and now they're in the process of trying to repatriate some of those assets, a fraction of those assets back to Equatorial Guinea. So in terms of the process of asset recovery, so those are the options of who initiates. In terms of the process of asset recovery, there are generally 4 major steps. There is a pre-investigation stage, there is an investigation stage, a judicial stage, and a recovery stage. The pre-investigation stage would be an informal conversation between the law enforcement authorities in the origin country, so the country that the assets are stolen from, and the law enforcement authorities in the destination country to do an assessment of whether there's enough to go on really to initiate action. And to do this, it takes a lot of understanding of the different legal processes between the countries, and actually even just acquaintances, having somebody to contact makes a real difference. Then you come to the investigation phase, where the government of the origin country would have to get into a mutual legal assistance agreement with the destination country's law enforcement and that country itself, in order to be able to identify, freeze and seize assets found in that country. So this is crucial, and this is something that is particularly important in relation to corruption, because we know money can be moved in a second right now in this globalized world. So it's really important to take that action, but political will is what we're lacking. And the judicial phase would be the culmination of that investigation stage, where a court in the destination country would give a verdict that these assets indeed are the proceeds of crime, and that it should be vested in that country's state, in the destination country's state. And then you come to the recovery phase of actually politically figuring out a way to get into an MOU, enter into an MOU with the origin country and repatriate those assets in a way where the assets will not be re-corrupted, where it will be recovered in a manner that is victim-centered, that is, it will be returned back to the people it was stolen from in a meaningful way. And the assets will be managed in a manner that you don't lose the value. If you look at, the Mustang that was parked outside the FCID, that is for the longest time in Sri Lanka, that is how you do not manage assets. So in order to do all of this, in 2018, there was a process of drafting a Proceeds of Crime Act to make all of these processes much smoother. And even the present government actually acknowledged this during a UN General Assembly special session on corruption in June last year. We are told that there is a draft on this, so the need of the hour actually is to push for this law to be passed while there is such a national interest in the issue. I will be ending really soon. And to actually empower law enforcement to take the necessary action to stop, to freeze assets, to seize assets while we can. In order to be able to do this, of course, law enforcement needs to act independently. And this is a good moment for it when it's no longer clear where the power center is. So even whistleblowers, law enforcement need to take stock of the situation, of the evidence that they have access to, and make sure that they take the necessary action to preserve this, memorialize this evidence, and seek accountability when the moment arises. I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.